Jake had always been the guy who laughed at ghost stories and rolled his eyes when people talked about seeing things in the sky that couldn't be explained. He was a photography student at the local college, and his camera was his way of proving that everything had a logical explanation. If you could capture something on film, you could understand it. That's exactly what he was thinking as he loaded his camera gear into his old pickup truck. On that Friday evening in October, his roommates Tom and Rick were already arguing about who forgot to pack the extra batteries, while his friend Lisa double-checked their camping supplies. They were heading out to one of the darkest places in Arizona, a spot about 3 hours from campus where city lights couldn't wash out the night sky. The plan was simple. They'd heard about a meteor shower that was supposed to peak around midnight, and Jake wanted to practice his long-exposure photography. He'd been working on a project for his advanced photography class, trying to capture the beauty of the night sky. His professor had challenged the students to find something unique, something that would make people stop and really look. The drive out to the desert was filled with the usual college road trip energy. They played loud music, shared stories about their week, and stopped twice for gas station snacks. Lisa navigated using an old paper map because cell service got spotty. Once they left the main highway, Rick kept making jokes about how they were going to end up lost in the middle of nowhere, eaten by coyotes, or worse, by the time they reached their camping spot. The sun was already setting behind the distant mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that made Jake wish he'd brought his color film instead of just black and white. The desert stretched out in all directions, dotted with tall saguaro cacti that looked like ancient guardians in the fading light. They set up camp quickly, working together to get the tents up before it got completely dark. Jake was particular about where he placed his equipment. He needed a spot away from their campfire, somewhere the light wouldn't interfere with his camera settings. He found the perfect place about 50 yards from the main camp, a small rise that gave him a clear view of the entire sky. As his friends settled in around the fire, roasting hot dogs and sharing a thermos of hot chocolate Lisa's mom had packed, Jake busied himself with his camera setup. He had his tripod positioned just right, his camera loaded with fresh film, and all his extra lenses arranged within easy reach. This was going to be the night he got the perfect shot. The temperature dropped fast once the sun disappeared completely. Desert nights were always cold, something that surprised people who thought of Arizona as always being hot. Jake pulled on his heavy jacket and wool hat, grateful that Lisa had reminded them all to pack warm clothes. By 11 o'clock, the sky was incredible, without any city lights for miles. The stars looked close enough to touch. Jake could see the Milky Way stretching across the darkness like a river of light. He started taking pictures, adjusting his settings between shots, trying to capture what his eyes were seeing. His friends had gone to bed around midnight, tired from the long drive and the excitement of being out in the wilderness. But Jake was wide awake, energized by the perfect conditions and the beauty of what he was seeing through his camera lens. This was exactly what he'd hoped for. That's when he first noticed the light. It started small, just a dot moving across the sky that he might have mistaken for a satellite. But satellites moved in straight lines at predictable speeds. This light was different. It moved in ways that didn't make sense, stopping and starting, changing direction without any apparent reason. Jake lowered his camera and watched with his naked eye, trying to figure out what he was looking at. Maybe it was a plane, though it was moving nothing like any aircraft he'd ever seen. Maybe it was some kind of military test. Though they were nowhere near any military bases, the light got brighter and bigger, and Jake realized it was getting closer, much closer. He could make out a shape now, though it was unlike anything he'd ever seen before. It was smooth and silent, moving through the air without any sound of engines or propellers. His photographer instincts kicked in, and he quickly adjusted his camera settings, trying to get a picture of whatever this thing was. His hands were shaking, partly from the cold but mostly from excitement and a growing feeling that something very unusual was happening. The object moved closer still, and Jake could see it more clearly now. It wasn't reflecting light like a normal aircraft would. Instead, it seemed to be glowing with its own soft, blue-white light that pulsed gently like a heartbeat. He managed to take several pictures, though he wasn't sure if the film would capture what he was seeing. The light from the object was unlike anything he'd photographed before, and he wasn't sure his camera settings were right for something that seemed to generate its own illumination. Then everything changed in an instant. The gentle pulsing light suddenly became blindingly bright, like someone had turned on the world's most powerful spotlight and pointed it right at him. Jake threw his hand up to shield his eyes, but the light seemed to come from everywhere at once. Even with his eyes closed and his hand blocking his face, the brightness was overwhelming. He tried to call out to his friends, to wake them up so they could see what was happening, but his voice seemed to disappear into the night air. The light was so intense that he couldn't see his own hands in front of his face, couldn't see his camera equipment, couldn't see anything but that brilliant, all-encompassing glow. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything went dark. Not the natural darkness of the desert night that he'd been enjoying all evening, but a complete, absolute darkness that felt like falling into a deep hole. The last thing Jake remembered was the feeling of his knees hitting the sandy ground as he collapsed, his camera tumbling from his hands, and a strange sensation that he was no longer alone in the vast emptiness of the desert. Jake's eyes opened slowly, like he was swimming up from the bottom of a deep pool. His head felt heavy and his thoughts were fuzzy, the way they get when you wake up from a really deep sleep. In the middle of the day, he tried to remember where he was, but everything felt strange and disconnected. The first thing he noticed was that he wasn't cold anymore. The desert night had been freezing, and he remembered pulling his jacket tight around him while he worked with his camera. But now, he felt perfectly comfortable, like he was in a climate-controlled room. He blinked a few times, trying to clear his vision. Above him was what looked like the ceiling of a tent, but it was too clean, too perfect. The material was a soft white color that seemed to glow gently with its own light. There were no wrinkles or sags like you'd expect from a camping tent, and he couldn't see any poles or support structures. Jake tried to sit up, but his body felt heavy and uncooperative. His muscles weren't sore exactly, just tired in a way that didn't make sense. He managed to turn his head to the side and saw equipment that looked medical, but not quite like anything he'd seen in a doctor's office before. There were screens, showing what looked like vital signs, but the displays were too clear, too bright, and the numbers changed in patterns that seemed almost hypnotic. The air smelled clean, like a hospital, but underneath that was something else, something that reminded him of the ozone smell after a lightning storm, sharp and electric. It wasn't unpleasant, just different from anything he'd experienced before. "You're awake," said a voice, and Jake turned toward the sound. A woman was sitting on a chair next to what he realized was some kind of examination table. She looked completely normal, the kind of person you might see working at the campus health center. Her brown hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she wore what looked like medical scrubs. Though the fabric seemed to shimmer slightly when she moved, Jake tried to speak, but his throat was dry. The woman noticed and reached for a cup of water that seemed to appear from nowhere. She helped him sit up enough to take a sip, and the water tasted better than any water he'd ever had. Clean and refreshing in a way that seemed to wake up his entire body. "Where am I?" Jake managed to ask, his voice coming out as barely more than a whisper. The woman smiled, and her smile was warm and genuine, like a nurse who actually cared about her patients. "You're safe," she said. "You've been sleeping for quite a while. You were talking in your sleep, actually, quite a lot." Jake tried to process this information, but it felt like trying to grab smoke with his hands. He remembered being in the desert, remembered the strange light, but everything after that was blank. "How long have I been asleep? Time moves differently here," the woman said, which wasn't really an answer but somehow felt like one. "The important thing is that you're feeling better now. Your body needed rest after what you experienced." She had a slight accent that Jake couldn't place, something that made certain words sound a little different than he expected. Her eyes were an unusual shade of green, almost a bright, and when she looked at him directly, he felt like she was seeing more than just his face. "What's your name?" Jake asked, trying to focus on something concrete. You can call me Dr. Chen, she said, though something about the way she said it made Jake think that might not be her real name. And you're Jake, correct? You mentioned your name several times while you were sleeping. The fact that she knew his name should have been reassuring, but instead it made him feel more confused. He tried to remember telling anyone his name, but his memories of recent events were like trying to recall a dream that was already fading. Dr. Chen stood up and walked over to one of the strange medical devices. She touched what looked like a blank surface, and suddenly it lit up with displays that meant nothing to Jake. Your vital signs are excellent, she said, though Jake hadn't felt her take his pulse or blood pressure. Better than excellent, actually. The experience seems to have been beneficial for your overall health. What experience? Jake asked. I remember camping with my friends. And then there was this light. And then he trailed off because there wasn't anything after that, just empty space where his memory should be. Dr. Chen turned back to him with that same warm smile. You spoke about many things while you were resting. Dreams, mostly, or what seemed like dreams. You talked about walking through places that don't exist on your world. You described star patterns that your astronomers haven't discovered yet. You even gave coordinates to locations that would be very interesting to certain researchers. Jake felt a chill despite the comfortable temperature. I don't remember any of that. Memory is a fascinating thing, Dr. Chen said, sitting back down in her chair. Sometimes our minds protect us by storing experiences in ways that feel less real. Dreams, for instance, can carry memories that are too overwhelming to process as waking experiences. She leaned forward slightly, and Jake noticed that her shadow seemed wrong somehow. It was too faint, too insubstantial, like she was lit by lights that weren't quite where they should be. Tell me, Jake, do you remember dreaming about a place with silver walls and windows that showed the curve of a blue planet? Do you remember conversations about mathematics and music, about the way different species understand time and space? As she spoke, Jake felt strange flashes of familiarity, like remembering a movie he'd seen long ago. He could almost picture the silver walls she mentioned, could almost hear voices discussing concepts that his waking mind couldn't quite grasp. Maybe, he said uncertainly. It's like trying to remember something that happened to someone else. Dr. Chen nodded as if this was exactly what she expected him to say. The mind has many ways of processing experiences that don't fit into our normal understanding of reality. Sometimes it's easier to file them away as dreams rather than try to integrate them into our conscious knowledge. She stood up again and walked to the edge of the tent. Jake noticed that when she moved, her feet made no sound against the floor, and her reflection in the metallic surfaces of the medical equipment seemed slightly out of sync with her actual movements. Your friends are looking for you, by the way, she said casually. They're quite worried. You've been missing for longer than you might think. Jake felt a surge of panic. Tom, Rick, and Lisa must be frantic. They were probably calling the park rangers, maybe even the police. How long have I been gone? Dr. Chen turned back to him with an expression that was both kind and sad. That's a more complicated question than you might realize, Jake. But don't worry about your friends right now. They're safe, and you'll see them again soon. First, though, we need to talk about what you learned while you were dreaming and what you want to do with that knowledge. Jake sat on the edge of what he was beginning to think wasn't really an examination table, trying to make sense of Dr. Chen's words. The more he looked around the tent, the more details seemed wrong. The walls were too smooth, the equipment too quiet, and the light came from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. What knowledge? He asked, though part of him was afraid of the answer. Dr. Chen pulled her chair closer and sat down, her green eyes studying his face carefully. You spent a considerable amount of time talking about things that most humans have never seen. Star maps, for instance. You described the binary system near Zeta Reticuli in detail that would impress most astronomers. Jake shook his head. I don't know anything about astronomy beyond what I learned in basic science classes. I'm a photography major, not an astrophysicist. And yet you spoke about gravitational lensing effects around distant stars, about the way light bends through space in ways that create natural telescopes across the galaxy. Dr. Chen's voice was gentle but insistent. You even drew diagrams in the air while you slept, showing mathematical relationships between planetary orbits that your scientists are just beginning to understand. As she spoke, Jake felt strange images flashing through his mind. He could almost see himself standing in front of a huge window, looking out at space filled with more stars than seemed possible. In the vision, someone was explaining how certain stars acted like magnifying glasses, making it possible to see planets that were incredibly far away. "That's impossible," he said. But his voice lacked conviction. The images in his head felt more real than dreams usually did. Dr. Chen reached into what looked like a pocket in her scrubs and pulled out a small device that resembled a tablet computer, but thinner and more flexible than any technology Jake had seen. She touched the surface, and it lit up with what looked like a star chart. "You described this constellation pattern 3 times while you were sleeping," she said, showing him the display. "These are stars that can only be seen from a very specific location in space, about 47 light-years from Earth. You even mentioned that the 3rd planet in this system has 2 moons and rings made of ice crystals." Jake stared at the star chart, and a chill ran down his spine because it looked familiar. Not like something he might have seen in a textbook or movie, but familiar in the way his childhood bedroom was familiar, like a place he'd spent real time. "How could I know that?" he whispered. "That's what we're trying to understand," Dr. Chen said, putting the device away. "But that's not all you talked about. You spent hours discussing Earth itself, but from a perspective that no human should have. You described the way your planet looks from space, the patterns of weather systems, the way cities light up the dark side of the world." She paused, watching his reaction carefully. "You also talked about your friends, about your life at college, about your dreams for your photography career. But you spoke about them like someone who was very far away, like someone who missed them terribly." Jake felt emotions rising up that he couldn't explain. There was a deep sadness, like homesickness, but mixed with excitement and wonder. It was the way he might feel if he'd just returned from the most amazing vacation of his life, but realized he might never be able to go back. "I don't understand what's happening to me," he said, and he was surprised to hear that his voice was shaky. Dr. Chen reached out and took his hand, and her touch was warm and comforting. "Your mind is protecting you, Jake. Sometimes when we experience things that are too far outside our normal understanding of reality, our consciousness finds ways to make them more manageable. Dreams, for instance, feel less threatening then. Memories." She stood up and walked to what Jake had thought was just another piece of medical equipment. But when she touched it, the surface became transparent, like a window. Through it, Jake could see what looked like space. Stars scattered across the darkness in patterns he'd never seen from Earth. "You weren't dreaming when you described the view from here," Dr. Chen said softly. "You were remembering." Jake's heart started beating faster. He wanted to dismiss what she was saying as impossible, but the view through that window looked exactly like something he'd seen before, even though he knew that was crazy. "Where exactly is here?" he asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. "We're in orbit around your planet," Dr. Chen said, as casually as if she'd said they were in the next town. "Over, about 400 kilometers up, roughly. The same altitude as your International Space Station, though in a different orbital path." Jake stared at her, then at the window, then back at her. "That's impossible. I would remember being in space. I would remember how I got here. Would you?" Dr. Chen asked. "If someone told you that you'd been living and working in a place like this for several days, learning things that would change everything you thought you knew about the universe, would your mind accept that as reality? Or would it be easier to file those experiences away as dreams?" She walked back to him and sat down again. "You spoke about the people you met here, Jake. You described conversations with individuals from different worlds, different species. You talked about learning new ways to think about time and space and consciousness. You even mentioned that you made friends." As she spoke, Jake felt more flashes of memory that didn't feel like memories. He could almost see faces that weren't quite human, but weren't completely alien either. He could almost hear voices speaking in languages he didn't recognize but somehow understood. You were particularly excited about a new type of photography. You learned, Dr. Chen continued, ways of capturing light and energy that human technology can't detect yet. You spent hours working with equipment that doesn't exist on Earth, creating images that show how the universe looks to species with different types of vision. Jake felt tears he didn't understand rolling down his cheeks. There was a sense of loss that was overwhelming, like he'd just realized he'd forgotten something incredibly important. Why can't I remember it clearly? He asked. Dr. Chen's expression was kind but sad. Because you asked us to help you process it this way. When it came time for you to return to your normal life, you were worried that carrying all these memories would make it impossible for you to function in your human world. You requested that we help your mind store the experiences as dreams and impressions, things you could explore gradually if you chose to. She pulled out the flexible device again and showed him another display. This one showed what looked like brain scans, but far more detailed than any medical imaging Jake had ever seen. Your consciousness expanded while you were here, she explained. You learned to perceive reality in ways that human brains aren't normally equipped for. But that kind of expansion can be overwhelming. Many humans who have similar experiences find it difficult to return to their previous lives. Without feeling constantly displaced and unhappy, Jake looked at the brain scans, seeing patterns of activity that seemed almost like artwork, beautiful and complex and completely beyond his understanding. So I chose to forget. You chose to let your mind protect itself while still retaining access to what you learned, Dr. Chen corrected. The knowledge is still there, Jake. The experiences are still part of you. They're just stored in a way that won't disrupt your ability to be human. She touched his hand again, and this time Jake felt a strange sense of recognition, like greeting an old friend after a long separation. The question now is what you want to do with that knowledge, and how you want to remember this conversation when you return to your friends. Jake stared at Dr. Chen for a long moment, trying to process everything she'd told him. The brain scans, the impossible knowledge, the idea that he'd somehow chosen to forget his own experiences. It all felt too big, too strange to be real. I need to see, he said finally. I need to understand what really happened to me. Dr. Chen nodded like she'd been expecting this request. Are you sure? Once you see, you can't unsee. Once you know, the knowledge becomes part of your conscious mind permanently. Jake thought about his friends back at the campsite, probably panicking and calling for help. He thought about his normal life, his photography classes, his plans for the future. All of that suddenly felt small and distant compared to whatever truth Dr. Chen was offering him. I need to know, he said. Dr. Chen stood up and walked to what Jake had assumed was just another wall of the tent. She placed her hand against it, and the material began to change. What had looked like solid fabric became transparent, then disappeared entirely. Like someone had opened invisible curtains, Jake's breath caught in his throat. They weren't in a tent at all. They were in a room with walls made of some kind of clear material, and beyond those walls was the most beautiful and terrifying sight he'd ever seen. Earth hung in the darkness of space like a blue and white marble, slowly rotating as they orbited around it. We're really in space, Jake whispered, his voice filled with wonder and fear. We're really in space, Dr. Chen confirmed. You've been here for 3 days, though time moves differently up here than it does on the surface. Your body adapted remarkably well to the environment. Jake stood up on shaky legs and walked closer to the transparent wall. He could see the curve of the planet below, the swirl of clouds over the oceans, the lights of cities on the dark side of Earth. It was exactly like the images he'd seen from NASA. But seeing it with his own eyes was completely different. How is this possible? He asked. How did I get here? How did nobody notice a spacecraft in the desert? Dr. Chen joined him at the window. We've been observing your species for a very long time. Jake, we've learned to be discreet. Your friends saw you disappear, but to them it looked like you simply walked away from the campsite and vanished into the desert. They've been searching, but they won't find any trace of where you actually went. She gestured toward a section of the room Jake hadn't noticed before. What he thought was medical equipment was actually much more sophisticated. There were displays showing star charts, weather patterns on Earth, and what looked like communication signals from various satellites. "We're researchers," Dr. Chen explained. "We study developing civilizations, particularly species that are on the verge of becoming spacefaring themselves. Humans are at a fascinating point in your development. You started to explore beyond your planet, but you haven't yet made contact with other intelligent life." Jake turned to look at her more carefully in the light coming from Earth. Her appearance seemed different somehow. Her features were still human, but there was something about the proportions that was slightly off, as if someone had painted a portrait of a person from memory rather than from life. "You're not human," he said. It wasn't a question. "Not exactly," Dr. Chen said with a sad smile, "though we're more similar to humans than different. We come from a planet about 47 light years from here. Our species evolved along a very similar path to yours, though we've had a few thousand more years to develop our technology." She walked over to another section of the room and touched what looked like a blank surface. Suddenly, images appeared in the air above them like a three-dimensional movie. Jake saw a planet that looked almost like Earth, but with purple oceans and two moons. Cities that seemed to grow out of the landscape rather than being built on top of it. People who looked almost human, but with those same slightly off proportions. He'd noticed in Dr. Chen. "This is my home," she said. "These are my people. And for the past 3 days, you've been learning about both." The images shifted, and Jake saw himself, but it wasn't the confused, frightened version of himself sitting in what he thought was a medical tent. This Jake looked confident and excited, walking through corridors that seemed to be made of light itself, talking animatedly with beings that looked like Dr. Chen. "You were curious about everything," Dr. Chen said, watching Jake's reaction to the images. "You asked questions constantly. You wanted to understand how our technology worked, how our society was organized, how we learned to travel between stars." Jake watched himself in the images, and memories started flooding back. Not dreamlike impressions this time, but real, clear memories. He remembered walking through a garden that existed inside the spacecraft, where plants from dozens of different worlds grew together in impossible harmony. He remembered sitting in what they called the observation deck, watching stars that were so far away they looked like tiny diamonds, while Dr. Chen and her colleagues explained how their ancestors had made the journey from their home world. "I remember the food," Jake said suddenly, surprising himself. "It tasted like everything I'd ever loved, but also completely new at the same time." Dr. Chen laughed, and the sound was musical in a way that no human laugh had ever been. "You were very enthusiastic about trying our cuisine. You said it was better than anything you'd ever eaten on Earth." More memories came flooding back. Jake remembered learning about their method of space travel, which didn't involve the rockets and fuel that humans used, but rather a way of folding space itself so that distant points became close together. He remembered being shown star maps that included not just the locations of planets, but information about which ones had life, which ones had intelligent species, and which ones were still developing. "There are so many of us," Jake said, his voice filled with wonder. "So many different kinds of life, so many civilizations. The universe is incredibly crowded," Dr. Chen agreed. "Though most species go through a phase like humanity is experiencing now, where they assume they're alone. It's a natural part of development, like a child believing their family is the only family in the world." Jake remembered conversations about this, about how humans would eventually make contact with other civilizations, but only when they were ready. There were protocols, agreements between different species about how to handle first contact situations. "Why me?" Jake asked. "Why was I chosen for this?" Dr. Chen's expression became more serious. "You weren't chosen randomly, Jake. We've been observing humans for several generations, looking for individuals who might be able to serve as informal ambassadors, people who are curious, open-minded, and stable enough to handle contact without being traumatized by it." She showed him more images. And Jake saw that he wasn't the only human who had been brought aboard their ship. There were others, people from different countries and backgrounds, all sharing the same sense of wonder and excitement that Jake remembered feeling. "We're preparing for eventual formal contact," Dr. Chen explained, "but that won't happen for several more decades when your species as a whole is ready. In the meantime, people like you help us understand human psychology and culture better." While also serving as a bridge between our worlds, Jake felt a deep sense of purpose that he'd never experienced before. Everything in his life, his curiosity about the world, his love of capturing images of things others might miss, his desire to understand and document reality, suddenly felt like it had been leading to this moment. "What happens now?" he asked. Dr. Chen walked back to the transparent wall and looked down at Earth. "Now you have a choice to make, Jake, and it's the most important decision you'll ever face." Jake stood at the transparent wall, looking down at Earth while Dr. Chen's words echoed in his mind. The most important decision he'd ever face. He could feel the weight of it, but he wasn't sure what exactly he was choosing between. "What are my options?" he asked, though part of him was afraid to hear the answer. Dr. Chen joined him at the window, and for a moment they both just watched the planet slowly turning beneath them. Jake could see the lights of cities, the swirl of weather patterns, the thin blue line of atmosphere that protected everything he'd ever known. "The first option is what we originally planned," Dr. Chen said. "We return you to your campsite with your memories stored as dreams. You go back to your normal life, finish college, pursue your photography career. The experiences you've had here remain accessible to you through meditation and dream work, but they don't interfere with your ability to function in human society." Jake nodded. That was what they'd discussed before, and it made sense. He could see how trying to live a normal life while carrying clear memories of this place would be almost impossible. How could he sit in a classroom learning about basic physics when he'd seen technology that folded space itself? "The second option," Dr. Chen continued, "is that we restore all your memories completely. You remember every conversation, every lesson, every moment of wonder you've experienced here. But you also carry the burden of knowing things that you can't share with anyone on Earth, at least not for many years." She turned to face him, her unusual green eyes serious. "People who choose this option often find it difficult to connect with their old lives. The knowledge changes you, Jake. It changes how you see everything. Some find it lonely." Jake thought about his friends, his family, his plans for the future. Would he still care about the same things? Would he still be able to relate to people who had no idea that the universe was full of life and wonder? "And the third option?" he asked, sensing that there was more. Dr. Chen smiled, but it was a sad smile. "The third option is that you stay here. You continue your education with us, learn about the galaxy, eventually visit other worlds. You become a permanent bridge between our species and yours." Jake's heart jumped. The idea was incredibly tempting. To keep learning, to see other planets, to be part of something bigger than anything he'd ever imagined. But, Dr. Chen continued, that choice means leaving your human life behind completely. Your friends and family would never know what happened to you. As far as Earth is concerned, you would simply disappear forever. The weight of the decision hit Jake like a physical blow. Stay and explore the universe, but lose everyone he'd ever loved. Or go back and try to live a normal life while carrying the knowledge that there was so much more out there. Is there no middle path? He asked. Dr. Chen was quiet for a long moment. There might be, she said finally. It's not something we usually offer because it's more complicated and potentially more difficult. But given your specific situation, given the way you've adapted to being here, we could try something different. She led him away from the window to a section of the room he hadn't seen before. There was a chair that looked almost like something from a dentist's office, but surrounded by equipment that hummed softly with energy. We could give you a hybrid memory structure, Dr. Chen explained. You would retain conscious memory of this conversation, of me, of the basic facts about our existence in your time here. But the deeper experiences, the technical knowledge, the details about other worlds and species, would remain stored as accessible dreams? Jake sat down in the chair, thinking. What would that mean? Practically, it would mean you could choose how much to remember and when, Dr. Chen said. Through meditation, through focused dreaming, through certain triggers we could implant, you could access deeper levels of your experiences here. But you wouldn't be overwhelmed by knowledge you couldn't use. She moved around the chair, adjusting settings on the equipment. It would also mean that as humanity gets closer to formal contact with other species, as your technology advances, as you personally develop the ability to handle more knowledge, you could gradually unlock more of what you learned here. Jake felt a sense of hope. This felt like the right answer, a way to honor both the incredible experience he'd had and the life he wanted to return to. There's one more thing, Dr. Chen said, holding up a small device that looked like a camera lens, but made of materials Jake had never seen before. We'd like to give you a way to document your ongoing journey. She handed him the device, and it felt warm and almost alive in his hands. This is a recording device that can capture not just images, but emotional impressions, energy patterns, things that your regular cameras can't detect. As you remember more of your experiences here, you'll be able to create a visual record that others might eventually be able to understand. Jake turned the device over in his hands. It was beautiful, like a piece of jewelry, but he could sense the incredible technology within it. How would I explain having this? You won't need to explain it for a while, Dr. Chen said. To most people, it will look like an interesting piece of equipment you picked up somewhere. But when the time is right, when humanity is ready for what it can reveal, you'll know how to use it. Jake made his decision. I want the hybrid option. I want to remember you. Remember this conversation. Remember that there's more out there. But I also want to be able to go home and be human. Dr. Chen nodded approvingly. I was hoping you'd choose that path. It's the most challenging, but also the most rewarding. You'll serve as a bridge between worlds in a way that honors both. She began adjusting the equipment around the chair. This won't hurt, she said. You'll feel a slight tingling sensation, and then a sense of your memories organizing themselves. When you wake up, you'll be back at your campsite. Jake felt the tingling. She described, like gentle electricity moving through his thoughts. His memories of the past 3 days began shifting, some moving to the front of his mind where they would be clear and accessible, others moving deeper where they would wait until he was ready for them. Will I see you again? He asked as his consciousness began to fade. That depends, Dr. Chen said, her voice becoming distant. If humanity continues to develop the way we hope, if you continue to grow and learn, then yes. Someday we'll meet again, either here or perhaps on my home world. The last thing Jake saw was her smile, warm and full of promise for the future. When Jake opened his eyes, he was lying on the sandy ground of the Arizona desert. The sun was just rising, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and reds. His camera equipment was scattered around him, and he could hear his friends calling his name in the distance. Tom appeared first, running over the small hill where Jake had set up his photography station. Jake, oh man, we've been looking for you everywhere. Are you okay? Jake sat up slowly, checking himself for injuries. He felt fine, better than fine actually. He felt like he'd been sleeping deeply for days. I'm okay, he said, and he was surprised to realize he meant it completely. Lisa and Rick appeared next, both looking relieved and worried. We were about to call the park rangers, Lisa said. You disappeared for 2 whole days. We found your equipment here, but no sign of you anywhere. 2 days. Jake looked around and noticed something that made his heart skip. Next to his regular camera bag was another case, one he'd never seen before, but that looked completely familiar. Inside, he somehow knew, was a device that could capture images of things most people couldn't see. I had the most incredible dream, Jake said, and realized that was both completely true and completely inadequate to describe. What had happened to him? As his friends helped him gather his equipment, Jake looked up at the lightening sky and smiled. Somewhere up there, Dr. Chen was probably watching, making sure he made it home safely. And someday, when humanity was ready, when he was ready, he would see her again. Until then, he had work to do, bridges to build, and pictures to take that would help prepare the world for the truth that was waiting among the stars.